The dropship shuddered as it pierced the upper atmosphere of Varela 9, its reinforced hull groaning from the sudden plunge into sub-zero turbulence. Nora Hayes sat upright in her harness, her gloved hands resting calmly on her lap, while the others around her muttered, adjusted their gear, or stared nervously at the ice-covered landscape beyond the fogged portholes. Across from her, a four-eyed cadet from Korthax Prime activated his visor overlay, scanning atmospheric data with twitching antennae. He clicked his mandibles in a nervous rhythm, clearly unsettled by the incoming storm front the instruments were detecting. Nora didn't need scanners. She'd seen skies like that before, back in Alaska, years ago, when she was just a kid huddled in a canvas tent beside her grandfather, learning how to listen to the wind. The sky had a pressure to it, a way it leaned in. It wasn't just cold. It was hollow in a way only humans seemed to recognize, the kind of cold that hunted. The moment the ramp dropped and the cadets filed out, their boots crunched into knee-deep powder that belied the solidity beneath. The surface snow was deceptive, light, dry, and blown in long, sweeping ridges by the wind. But underneath was densely packed crust, solid enough to walk on if one knew how to distribute weight. The other cadets stumbled, some sinking to their thighs as they trudged across the uneven terrain toward the rally point marked by glowing perimeter stakes. Nora moved with deliberate slowness, scanning the landscape. The jagged ice cliffs to the north were a natural windbreak, and the depression to the west could funnel gusts directly into their camp, if not accounted for. She noted snow composition, wind patterns, slope angle, and sun position, even though the dim Virellan star barely cast enough light to define shadows. The cold didn't bother her yet. She'd worn worse in winter training. At the command post, Instructor Varric, a tall reptilian male with glinting ocular plates and ceremonial armor, waited for them. His voice, amplified through a static-ridden comm system, was brisk. "You have 36 hours to establish independent survival shelters," he announced. "No external equipment will be provided. Personal packs only. No interference from instructors unless critical bio levels are breached. Those who survive score advancement. Those who fail will be extracted and penalized accordingly." The cadets exchanged glances. No one dared ask questions. They'd trained for this, or at least thought they had. Most were from high-gravity worlds, lava-covered moons, or aquatic environments, not ice planets with hurricane-force gales and predatory cold. Their minds, conditioned by simulations and tech-reliant tactics, immediately calculated options. Thermal shield deployment, emergency energy fields, microfusion tents, smart gels. Everyone had a plan. Nora stepped away from the group without comment. She didn't need a plan. She needed snow and silence. The location she chose was a slight rise near the edge of the windbreak, partially shielded by an overhang of stratified ice. It wasn't perfect, but it had slope, coverage, and compressed snow layers that she could work with. She dropped her pack and pulled out a small collapsible shovel, nothing more than a carbon fiber blade with a worn leather grip. The others watched her from a distance, confused, then amused. "She's digging?" one of the insectoid cadets whispered with a buzz, barely containing his laughter. "What does she think this is? A burial?" A crystalline Velkari female tilted her head, her eyes refracting light like prisms. "She's building into the snow." Primitive. Inefficient. Nora heard them. She didn't look up. She began packing snow into bricks using a method so old it had no record in the galactic archives. Each block was cut from the hard-packed crust layer with smooth, practiced motions, then carefully stacked in an inward spiral, slightly tilted for structural strength. She didn't rush. She didn't speak. Her breath fogged with each exhale, but she moved like a sculptor, not a cadet. Around her, the others activated their shelters. Small dome-like fields shimmered into place as miniaturized generators hummed to life. Lights blinked. Temperatures stabilized. The cadets settled inside their tech cocoons, proud of their efficiency. Some even sneered at her openly, their eyes gleaming behind polarized visors. "She won't last the night," muttered a scaled cadet from Tavarn, adjusting his thermal wraps. "Let her build her cave. It'll collapse once the frost sets in." Still, Nora didn't flinch. Her fingers ached, but her mind was still. Each brick interlocked with the next. The entrance was curved, the top vented, the floor dug lower than the door, all tricks her grandfather taught her to keep warm air trapped and moisture out. Every motion was purposeful, efficient, ancestral. Snow began to fall again, fine and dry like powdered sugar, blown sideways by rising wind. The sky darkened. A low groan echoed across the ice plains, the voice of the approaching storm. The temperature plummeted further, now nearing -60°C. Even the cadets inside their high-tech shelters began to show signs of concern. One adjusted his suit's core temperature manually. Another tried to recalibrate her shield field to resist the increasing atmospheric pressure. One generator beeped a warning. Nora placed the final capstone on her igloo, sealing it with packed slush that quickly hardened into an icy cement. Then she crawled inside, lit a small chemical heat stone from her emergency kit, and sat cross-legged on the cold floor. Her breath no longer fogged. The temperature was rising inside, slowly, steadily, safely. Outside, the wind began to scream. Inside her shelter, she smiled. She didn't care who laughed. By the end of the storm, they would stop laughing and start knocking. The wind's voice changed first. What had been a steady howl transformed into a guttural roar that rose and fell in irregular bursts, as if the very atmosphere of Varela 9 were gasping for breath. Snow no longer drifted gently. It lashed sideways, slamming against shields, gear, and exposed skin with needle-sharp precision. Visibility dropped to less than 10 meters. The landscape, already monochrome, dissolved into a whirl of blinding white and flashing red sensor warnings. Cadet Serac, the Velkari female with crystal-layered skin, stood outside her dome shield watching the storm build, her angular face reflecting pulses of light from her visor. She had expected more. Her people had trained on comet-battered moons and mined cores of gas giants. She had scoffed at the idea that this mission would challenge her. But now her shield was struggling against the atmospheric density. The energy field shimmered erratically, the stabilizers whining with rising strain. She tapped her wrist module, trying to reroute auxiliary power from her internal suit reserves into the perimeter generator. To her right, Cadet Brule, a hulking reptilian male from the lowlands of Crexus 3, crouched near his own failing shelter. His thick scales, usually resistant to heat loss, were beginning to show frost buildup along the ridges of his shoulders. His breath escaped in short, visible bursts. The emergency heater at the base of his tent flickered with each gust of wind, and snow began piling against the rear side of the shield dome. He muttered curses in his native tongue and dug into the snow with gloved claws to reinforce the barrier, but the storm pushed back harder with every passing minute. Farther downslope, one of the insectoid cadets, a wiry male named Riken, was frantically trying to restart his collapsed micro-shelter. It had folded inward under wind pressure just after sunset. His segmented limbs worked in a blur, antennae vibrating violently in the cold. His exosuit wasn't designed for open exposure in such extreme cold, and small fissures had already appeared around the joints. He slapped a power cell into the generator socket, but the device sparked weakly and died with a high-pitched whine. He looked up, blinking with all four of his compound eyes, but no one came to help. No one spoke. The drill forbade communication unless life signs dropped below critical. Pride did the rest. Above them all, just below the ice overhang, Nora lay flat inside her igloo. Her coat was damp from sweat, her muscles sore, but she was warm. Not comfortable, that wasn't the point, but safe. The air inside was thick with her breath, but she'd carved 2 vent holes to maintain circulation, one at ground level and one near the top. The heat stone glowed softly in the middle of the floor, its warmth slowly radiating off the packed walls and floor. She listened to the wind, not with fear, but with focus. Each pitch change, each pressure drop, told her something. She didn't need a weather station. She was the weather station. Nora pulled a thermal wrap from her pack and folded it under her back. The igloo creaked faintly as the wind outside battered its curved walls, but the structure held firm. Snow compacted tighter with pressure. It became denser, stronger. She closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment to rest. Outside, the storm escalated. By midnight, the cold was beyond lethal. Temperature sensors across the training zone reported readings of minus 72 degrees Celsius. Thermal shields across the camp began to drop to emergency modes. The smart gels used by some of the alien cadets to insulate their domes hardened into brittle shells, cracking from the sudden expansion. Internal systems locked into power conservation protocols. Lights dimmed, generators beeped. Brule stood now, chest rising and falling with force as he attempted to haul a frozen tarp over the gaping split in his tent. The material had torn free of its anchors, exposing one side of his shelter to the wind. He roared in frustration and hammered the corner into the snow with a half-frozen boot, then stomped to the other side to do the same. His tail dragged through the snow behind him like a wounded limb. He had stopped feeling his feet 10 minutes ago. Serac was no longer visible through the snow. Her energy shield had collapsed completely, and she had retreated inside her suit's emergency cocoon. The device encased her in a crystalline layer of reactive polymers, barely enough to trap body heat, but insufficient for long-term exposure. She curled into a seated position and began manually regulating her oxygen intake to preserve internal warmth. Her fingers trembled, despite her biological advantages. She had never felt cold like this. Riken didn't make it back to his crater shelter. He was found crawling back toward the main camp beacon, his legs stiff and unresponsive. He tried activating his distress signal, but the device refused to register his movement. In the darkness, only one glow stood out, a soft amber light. It pulsed gently through the storm, barely visible beyond the swirling snow, but enough to trigger the base instincts of a freezing mind. Riken's antennae caught the flicker. He turned, staggered forward, fell, then crawled toward it, one hand dragging his disabled signal beacon. Nora's igloo pulsed from within. She had lit a second heat stone when the inner temperature dipped during a particularly violent gust. The light bled through the ventilation opening, casting a strange, warm aura around the dome. She sat upright now, frowning slightly. She had heard movement. Not the storm, something dragging. A body. Her hand reached for the flap she had fashioned at the entrance. Then, a sound. A low knock. Instinct pushed her forward before hesitation could intervene. She pulled back the flap and was immediately struck by a wave of freezing air and snow. A collapsed form lay just beyond the opening, arms shaking, fingers curled. She reached out, grabbed the cadet's shoulder, and pulled him inside in one motion. Riken barely registered what was happening. His body collapsed onto the igloo floor, limbs twitching violently from the contrast in temperatures. Nora sealed the entrance and pulled her emergency wrap over him, then pressed one of the heat stones against the joint of his carapace, just above the thorax. His chest expanded sharply as warmth returned to his lungs. He made a sharp clicking sound, a Korthaxi expression of gratitude or disorientation, she couldn't tell. She didn't say anything. She sat beside him in silence, watching his tremors slow. The storm outside deepened still. By 0300, 4 more shelters had failed, and 2 more cadets were crawling toward the faint glow beneath the cliff, the only structure still standing, the only one not built by engineers, the only one built by hand. Serac's vision blurred as the cold bit deeper. Her crystalline skin, once a source of pride, now refracted what little light remained into dizzying fragments. She could no longer distinguish the direction of the wind, only that it now roared like a wounded beast, dragging her thoughts into the void of exhaustion. Her emergency cocoon had turned rigid, layers of reactive polymer hardening around her torso and limbs like a coffin. Every intake of breath felt thinner than the last. She had recalibrated her oxygen thrice, but the internal temperature continued to plummet. A thin crack formed along her left shoulder plate, a soundless fracture under mounting cold. Her mind, trained for logic and order, struggled to hold on to focus. The storm showed no mercy. It escalated beyond prediction, becoming something Varela 9 had not delivered in decades. Temperatures dipped to lethal levels not seen since the last magnetic surge tilted the planet's jet stream. Snow moved like smoke, twisting in cyclones that obscured the landscape, swallowing movement, burying technology, silencing distress beacons. Brule stumbled forward, his shoulders hunched against the wind, dragging a makeshift sled behind him. The tarp that once covered his shelter now served as a drag mat, layered with snow and bound with melted insulation foam. He had tied it to his wrist with a fiber cord, his claws too stiff for knots. His thick reptilian tail no longer lifted behind him, but scraped along the ground like dead weight. His boots crunched against icy terrain, his knees threatening to give with each step. His body, despite its genetic resistance to temperature shock, had long since passed optimal thresholds. He had watched Riken vanish into the storm earlier, crawling toward a flicker of light that no sensor could verify. Brule hadn't moved then. He didn't believe the insectoid cadet would survive more than a few minutes. But when that same flicker reappeared, steady, pulsing like a distant fire beacon, he knew he had no better option. Each step became a choice between breath and motion. A low-pitched frequency pulsed from his helmet, a medical alarm soft enough not to trigger automatic evacuation, but loud enough to be a warning. Blood flow decreasing, organs approaching cryostasis. He ignored it. Up the ridge, Nora sat against the far wall of the igloo, keeping her body between the opening and the two cadets already inside. Riken remained curled under thermal wrap, his legs twitching less now. His color had returned slightly, not vibrant, but alive. The second arrival, a small feline humanoid from the Andari sector named Leo, lay unconscious against the inner curve of the dome. Her fur was soaked, her suit barely functional. Nora had used the last of her backup batteries to power one of the micro-heaters inside her boots, now repurposed to direct warmth toward Leo's core. The igloo had grown smaller with the addition of new bodies. It was never meant to house more than one, maybe two in an emergency. Condensation had begun to form near the top, turning into icy droplets. The floor had softened slightly beneath the weight of bodies and gear, but the structural integrity held. Nora checked the vent holes again, clearing snow from the top channel with a quick jab of her multi-tool. The wind howled through the narrow opening like a trapped spirit, but the airflow stabilized. She returned to her seat, listening. A sound. Faint. Not the storm. A low grunt. Then the slow, dragging crunch of boots. She moved fast, pulled back the flap. The wind nearly ripped it from her hand. Brule stood there, half collapsed, the front of his armor scorched from generator feedback. His scaled face, usually a deep green, had turned a sickly blue-gray. His eyes met hers for only a second before his legs gave out. She caught him under the arm and dragged him inside with a sharp grunt of effort. His body was heavy, nearly double her weight, but she rolled him onto the mat between Riken and Leo, then covered him with the last emergency cloth she had in her pack. The moment the entrance was sealed again, Brule's chest started to rise in shallow, raspy gasps. Nora placed one hand against his side. The armor retained almost no heat. She adjusted the position of the active heat stone to cover more surface area and leaned forward to watch for signs of lucidity. He didn't respond. She turned and looked at the cramped interior. 3 cadets, 1 stone, no remaining rations. Her own reserves were down to half a liter of water and 2 protein cubes. She hadn't planned for charity. She hadn't needed to. Nora adjusted her coat and folded her arms across her knees. She leaned her head back, her eyes flickering toward the faint light pulsing from the stone. She didn't regret letting them in, but she knew the storm was far from over, and the igloo was now at its limit. Outside, The storm screamed louder than ever. At the far edge of the training zone, Serac stirred. Her cocoon had reached critical failure. The crack on her shoulder had widened, now branching down toward her upper arm. The cold had bled through the internal membrane. Her energy was gone. Her thoughts erratic. The storm had erased all orientation. She no longer knew where she had fallen. The beacon on her wrist blinked, but her arm no longer responded to neural input. Her last thought before unconsciousness took her was neither fear nor anger. It was humiliation. The storm didn't pause to respect her. Hours passed. Inside the igloo, the temperature rose slightly as the bodies of the cadets generated passive warmth. The air grew thicker. Nora wiped condensation from her cheek and leaned over Brule again. His eyelids fluttered. A low, guttural growl escaped his throat as his consciousness returned. He looked around, eyes adjusting to the soft glow. His gaze fell on Nora, confused, then disbelieving. "You built this?" he asked, voice a low rasp. She didn't nod. She didn't need to. His head fell back. He didn't speak again. Outside, a new sound emerged through the storm. Not the shriek of wind or the hum of failing technology. A knock, then another. Nora didn't move immediately. She waited to confirm it wasn't debris. The knock came again, rhythmic, precise. She opened the flap. Light caught in fragments of crystal. Serac. Her face was pale, ice coating her shoulders, her legs unresponsive beneath her. Her fingers barely clung to the edge of the dome. She had dragged herself up the incline with the last of her strength. Nora leaned out and grabbed her by the wrist. She didn't stop to consider weight or space. She simply pulled. The flap closed with difficulty this time. The wind was more aggressive, clawing at the edges of the entrance like it was trying to peel the igloo open from the outside. Inside, Serac collapsed beside Brule with a dull thud, her limbs seizing from deep system shock. Her crystalline plates were coated in frost, her left arm bent at an unnatural angle, and faint fractures ran down the length of her shoulder like a web of cracks in glass. She didn't speak. Her breath came in shallow bursts, and her jaw clenched so tightly that her teeth chattered against one another like metal on stone. Nora moved quickly. She didn't have spare heat, so she adjusted the positioning of the other cadets and pulled Serac closer to the center. She tore open one of her thermal wraps and stuffed the lining into the largest fissure in Serac's armor to reduce exposure. The cadet's body shivered, but her eyes opened just enough to recognize the dim amber light around her. Serac didn't ask questions. She couldn't. But her eyes scanned the dome with disbelief. She had known the human was stubborn. She had not imagined she would find survival here. Not in a crude shelter of snow, not in warmth shared by strangers who had every reason to ignore one another. The igloo groaned under the weight of the wind. The ceiling shimmered slightly as fine snow leaked in through a vent hole clogged by ice. Nora reached up with her multi-tool and reopened the airway with careful pressure, avoiding collapse. The temperature inside was beginning to rise again, but every movement now required negotiation. Space was a luxury they no longer had. 6 bodies lay shoulder to shoulder: Nora, Riken, Brule, Leo, Serac, and one quiet figure who had arrived while Nora pulled Serac inside, a serene cadet named Mile. He had not spoken a word. His face was pale, his hair frozen in thick strands, but he had curled into the wall and remained conscious, eyes half shut, watching. Nora turned to him now. "How long have you been here?" she asked, her voice low and hoarse. He blinked slowly. "Since you brought the second one in," he whispered. "You didn't knock?" "I didn't want to waste your heat." She almost smiled, but didn't. There was no energy for sentiment. She simply nodded once and passed him a half piece of the last protein cube, which he accepted without hesitation. Everyone had already gone past dignity. Only survival remained. The minutes dragged, then the hours. The storm intensified beyond what even the instructors had likely anticipated. Something in the upper atmosphere must have fractured, because the wind pressure began to press down on the igloo from above. Snow built rapidly on the roof. The soft creaks in the structure became louder. Brule shifted uneasily. "It's holding," Nora said before he could speak. "But for how long?" he asked. "As long as it needs to." No one else spoke. The silence was thick, not from tension, but from surrender. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the acknowledgement that their lives were bound to the structure a single human had built without a scanner, blueprint, or shield field. And it hadn't collapsed. Not yet. Not even when the others had. A sound broke the silence. A distant crack, low and thunderous. Not close, but somewhere out beyond the wind wall. Leo stirred, her ears twitching as her body re-entered full consciousness. She gripped the edge of her wrap and turned toward the sound. "That was a generator," she said softly. "One of the big ones." Nora nodded. "Probably the central uplink." "Which means the instructors can't monitor us anymore," Mael added. "Or extract us," Serac murmured, barely audible. A hush fell again. Nora adjusted the heat stone's position, setting it inside the hollowed snow depression at the center of the igloo. She had dug it specifically to keep heat low and radiating evenly. Now it flickered, casting golden ripples along the curved walls. For a brief moment, the dome looked alive, a womb of warmth against a world that wanted them dead. Riken sat up slowly, his voice scratchy. "Why did you let us in?" he asked. No one else had the courage to ask it first. Nora took her time to answer. She could feel 6 pairs of eyes on her. "Because I could," she finally said. "But you had no guarantee we would do the same," Brule said. "You could have been alone in here, warm, quiet. You would have survived the storm by yourself." "Maybe," she replied. "Or maybe not." "Doesn't matter." Serac shifted, pain flashing across her face. "You were trained for this." "My grandfather taught me how to build an igloo," Nora said. "He didn't have a university degree. He didn't wear armor. But he never died in a storm." Silence again. But this one was different, heavier, full of slow, dawning understanding. Leo reached into her pocket and pulled out a small identification chip, holding it in her palm. "Everything on this moon failed," she said. "All our training, our equipment, our protocols. But this didn't." She gestured toward the curved dome around them. Serac looked away, shame etched across her face like the cracks in her armor. Brule reached forward and set his palm flat against the snow wall. "I don't understand how something so soft could be stronger than our strongest composites." Nora looked at him. "Because it doesn't fight the storm. It lets it pass." A gust slammed into the wall as if to test her words. The dome bent slightly, then returned to its shape. The snow, compressed by weight and warmth, was harder now than ice. Mael gave a small laugh, a dry, exhausted breath. "You'll be a legend after this." "No," Nora said. "This shouldn't be legendary. It should be common sense." She leaned her head back against the wall again and closed her eyes for a moment. Her muscles ached. Her hands were raw. Her own core temperature was lower than ideal, but manageable. The others didn't speak again. They sat in silence, listening to the storm outside, listening to the wind scream over a structure made of snow and instinct, listening to the truth of their failure and the quiet triumph of the only one who hadn't relied on the tools they'd always been taught were essential. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, no one moved. But for the first time, none of them felt truly alone. The first light didn't arrive with brilliance, but with a slow blue deepening that filtered through the frozen air like breath underwater. Nora felt it before she saw it. A subtle shift in pressure, a whisper of calm in the long howl of the storm. The wind no longer screamed. It murmured now, resigned and tired. She opened her eyes and saw a faint shimmer of morning bleeding through the upper vent, catching the haze of frost on the ceiling like starlight on rough glass. The others were stirring slowly. None had slept deeply, not with limbs cramping from confined space, not with body heat shared between strangers who, a day ago, might not have offered each other a second glance. But no one complained. The silence had transformed into a kind of peace, even reverence. Riken pressed a hand to his own chest, as if surprised to still feel a pulse. Mael sat cross-legged near the flap, his hands resting loosely on his knees, watching the way the light bent through the snow bricks like it was holy. Serac hadn't spoken all night, but her eyes were open, and her mouth was no longer drawn in pain. Brule sat hunched, half shivering, half laughing at nothing, and Leo quietly chewed the last of a protein chip she had saved, then offered Nora half without being asked. Nora accepted it and gave a brief nod. No one rushed to leave the igloo. The storm was over, but the cold remained. The silence outside now felt heavier than the wind ever had, as if the planet itself were waiting to see what would emerge from the storm it had conjured. Nora unsealed the flap slowly. A sheet of wind-smoothed snow resisted at first, then broke away in a gentle cascade. She pushed her head out and blinked into the light. The landscape was unrecognizable. The ridge had vanished beneath drifts at least 2 meters deep. Most shelters were either crushed or buried. Only faint geometric humps gave away their locations. The main beacon had collapsed under ice. Nothing moved. Nothing blinked. It was as if the planet had wiped the slate clean overnight. She stood up, careful not to collapse the entrance, and pulled herself free of the igloo. The air bit at her cheeks, but it no longer threatened to steal her breath. The storm had passed. Behind her, Brule emerged next, grunting from the effort. He took one look around and released a low, disbelieving whistle. "Nothing's left," he muttered. Mael came after him, shielding his eyes with one hand. Serac needed help. Riken supported her on one side while Leo steadied her other. Together, the 6 cadets stood in a line at the base of the ridge, facing a field of devastation. A high-pitched tone suddenly chirped in the distance. Then another. Then a crackle of static pierced the morning air. "Unit Delta, respond," said a voice through the wind. "Unit Delta, visual acquired. Tracking signal from Cadet Hayes. Preparing retrieval." Nora lowered her eyes. She hadn't activated her beacon, but apparently someone had routed the signal manually. She turned her head. Mael gave a small shrug. "I guessed you wouldn't turn it on," he said. "But if you didn't make it, someone would need to know where your body was." She almost smiled. She didn't. Within minutes, 3 hovercraft emerged from the horizon, dark, flat-bottomed, fitted with retrieval arms and medical pods. They slid over the snow like shadows, cutting through silence with a hum that felt almost alien after the storm. Nora watched them approach with no emotion. The storm had taken everything it could from her. What remained was not relief. It was resolve. The lead craft descended beside the group. A tall figure emerged, Instructor Varric. His posture was perfect, his armor gleaming with condensation from the hovercraft's warm interior. He surveyed the 6 cadets with an expression unreadable beneath his opaque visor. "Cadet Hayes," he said finally. "Report." She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the rasp in her throat. "Shelter held. No fatalities. Minimal injuries. Energy consumption negligible. All cadets survived inside a passive structure constructed without advanced equipment." Varric tilted his head slightly. "Your shelter was not authorized," he said. "It worked," she replied. He looked over the others, who stood without flinching, despite frostbite, exhaustion, and bruises beneath their armor. Serac met his gaze with a defiance she had not possessed yesterday. Brule straightened his spine. Riken's mandibles clicked once, sharp and certain. Varric paused for a long moment. "Your solution," he said slowly, "was not optimal by standard criteria." Nora didn't respond. But it was effective. He tapped a command into his wrist module. One of the other instructors, a smaller, hunched Avathi male, approached and silently handed Nora a data chip. She looked at it. A blank surface, no designation. Your actions will be submitted to Tactical Command as an outlier case study. You will be debriefed privately at Station Echo, Varric said. Then, after a pause, your fellow cadets have requested to submit joint commendation testimony. It has been approved. Nora looked at the group. No one said anything. But the way Brule lifted his chin, the way Serac stepped slightly closer to her side, the way Mael rested his hand gently against her arm for half a second, it was enough. More than enough. As the hovercraft opened their rear compartments and loaded the others into recovery bays, Nora remained outside, standing next to the Igloo. It was already beginning to sag in the rising light, its perfect curves softening as heat and time took their toll. Soon it would collapse. Then it would melt. Then it would disappear entirely, as if it had never existed. But it had existed, and it had saved them all. Varric turned to leave, but paused at the ramp. You were underestimated, cadet, he said without looking back. You will not be again. Then he stepped aboard. Nora followed last. She took one final look at the fading shape in the snow, then climbed into the craft without a word. Above them, the Virilan sun rose higher, spilling pale gold across a battlefield of silence. The storm was gone. The survivors were few. But those who endured had learned something no sensor, no training simulation, no power armor could teach. Survival is not always about strength. Sometimes it's about listening to the wind. Sometimes it's about knowing when to dig into the snow instead of fighting the storm. And sometimes it's about building a home from nothing, just long enough for others to live through the night.